Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Mona Hemmati. On behalf of our organizing team, I would like to welcome you to today's RiskCon webinar on compound risk. So before we get started, I would like to make some announcements. So the next webinar will be on October 18th.
I think it's the 19th.
19th?
Yeah.
So
we'll send out a message.
Yeah, okay. October 19th, Ayana Atto from University of Berlin will talk about cascading climate risk and adaptive and resilient European societies. So the other thing is that there's a conference in June 2023 in Germany with title of Climate-Related Systematic Risk, Lesson Learned from COVID-19. There is a travel grant, so if you're a postdoc or PhD student, you can apply for that. The deadline for this travel grant is September 18th. So let's go back to our webinar. So today we have a very exciting talk. I'm sure that there's no need to introduce our today invited speaker, Professor Philip Ward, as most of us have learned a lot from his innovative research. But for some of you that may not know, Professor Philip Ward is a head of Global Water and Climate Risk, section of Department of Water and Climate Risk at VU Amsterdam University. His current research focuses on flood and drought risk assessment at the global and continental scale. And he's here today to talk about a pilot project for a multi-hazard, multi-sector, and systematic risk management. So, Professor Ward, thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours. So I just end the slideshow, so you can share your screen.
Yeah, thank you very much. It still says, yeah, there we go. Now I think I can share. Let me check that you can see the screen. Yeah, okay, so yeah, hello everybody, and thank you very much for the welcoming words, Mona and Colin, and really nice to be invited to give this talk and to be able to present some of our work in MYRIAD-EU to this community. I think I was presented there as being a professor or working on interactions between floods and droughts, and that is very much the case. This project has really taken me even beyond this comfort zone, actually, into all kinds of natural hazards, whether they be floods, droughts, seismic, volcanoes, and also biological hazards. So it's quite a challenge, but also really nice to look at all of these true interactions between these different hazards types. So in the next 25 minutes or half an hour or so, I'll be talking about MYRIAD-EU, which is a project we started 1 year ago, and it has another 3 years to go, funded by the European Union in a Horizon 2020 call. And it's a project that I'm managing together with Marleen de Ruiter and Timothy Tichelhoven at the VU University in Amsterdam. And what's it all about? Well, it's all about how can we better prepare for, assess and manage these kinds of multi-hazard and multi-risk events. So first of all, why are we even interested in these kinds of multi-risk events? And I'm just going to give this example here of the, should be a video showing, that's not working. But anyway, the Hunga Tonga eruption last December. And well, what you should be seeing now is a video where you see this huge ash cloud erupting from the volcano. In fact, one of the largest volcanic eruptions on record. And this occurred on the island of Tonga and had real huge direct impacts on the people living there, right? There's a lot of people working in agriculture, and about 75% of those agriculturalists were actually affected in some way or another by this event, ash falling on the crops, damaging the crops, but also equipment, housing, and so forth. So huge direct impacts of this event, but also it led to some rather far-flung impacts through connections between the hazards. So the volcanic eruption led to a tsunami, which actually led to flood impacts right across the Pacific Ocean, for example, in California, in Santa Cruz, also along the coast of Peru and Japan. Also hazards were felt as a result of the tsunami. But other knock-on effects, coming back to Tonga, well, after the event, there's a lot of people were coming in with foreign aid, right, to help bring in medicines, food supplies, cleanup operations, etc. And this actually led to the first introduction of COVID-19 into Tonga, which until that time had actually been successful in keeping the virus out. So this adds another layer of complexity onto that risk profile at that time. Also, the people are already vulnerable because of the volcano, are then extra vulnerable to the exposure to this virus. So this is really a classic example of showing that not only how can these hazards interact, but also how can these risks interact with each other. And I think a lot of people within this risk CAN community have been working a lot on all of these types of hazard interrelations in the past. There's many kinds of interrelations. There's several classifications of these, for example, the one by Jakob Scheisler and Colin as well. But I've just put down here just some examples of some kinds of interrelated effects that hazards can have on risks, like the triggering ones that we see up here, where we have, for example, rainfall, which could trigger a landslide. We see them here. The amplifying effects, for example, heat and drought occur at the same time, which would amplify those the chance of forest fires. These kind of compound events. So here we see a compounded flood because we have this region being faced by both fluvial, river, and coastal flooding interacting at the same time, and also consecutive events. So early in this Europe, we had three named storms, Dudley, Eunice, and Franklin, within 8 days of each other. And the fact that they occurred in the same place in quick succession meant that a lot of places were out of electricity or disconnected the transport links for a long time, causing business interruptions, etc. And so within MYRIAD, what we're interested in is really looking at how can risk be better managed if we actually consider these kinds of interrelated effects. We also know that disaster risk reduction measures that one takes for one hazard might actually cause an increase in risk from other hazards, so-called assynergies. I have an example here. We see a house which is in an area which faces flooding. It's built on stilts. But in this case, an earthquake has occurred, and that means that it's actually been knocked down because of the shaking. And so we really want to look at how can we, within the project, how can we better account for these dynamic feedbacks between these kinds of risk drivers. And then also, we also know that that not only impacts that go across hazards, but also that go across different sectors. So here we see a typical landscape in Northwest Europe. It could be faced by many hazards, right? So flooding, drought, hail, for example, in this region. And we see that this area has lots of sectors. Okay? We see housing in the background, agriculture in the foreground, and also energy with these windmills and also the solar panels. And all of these things are competing for space. And if you take one measure to protect against the hazard, it will have different impacts on those different sectors. So we also want to look at how we can account for these trade-offs and synergies, and not only across the regions and sectors, but also across these different kinds of sectors. So it's a little bit of it's quite a complex issue that we face, a complex project. We set out a vision to say that after this project, what we want to do is to really catalyze the paradigm shift that we think is needed to move towards a multi-risk, multi-sector, and systemic approach to assessing and managing not flood, but all kinds of risks. And this sounds nice, of course. It's in the proposal. It's quite a lofty vision, but we try to make it a little bit more tangible as well with this aim, which was that in 3 years' time now, so by the end of the project, the policy makers, decision makers, and practitioners with whom we work will be able to develop forward-looking disaster risk management pathways that actually assess these trade-offs and synergies across sectors, hazards, and scale. So really coming up with a disaster risk management plan for their own regions. And then to do that, we set up the project really around 5 pilot regions, or 5 pilot case studies, quite large case studies, which you can see here throughout Europe. So we have a case study in the Canary Islands, one in Veneto, one in the Danube, one in Scandinavia, and one in the North Sea. And this latter one in the North Sea is really looking at not just the countries around the North Sea, but really the interactions between land and ocean, right? So you see those connections come together. And what we actually try to do is first, together with our stakeholders in each of these pilot regions, is to define a future challenge that they want to actually address, the sustainability challenge. For example, in the Canary Islands, this is a region which has about 80 to 90% of the GDP coming from tourism. So very dependent on tourism. So a question that one could ask is, how can island regions with such a strong dependence on tourism become more resilient to multi-hazard risks? Now, we then identify different economic sectors which are important for addressing this challenge within the region. For example, obviously, in this case, tourism would be one of them. Food and agriculture. So about a vast majority of the food is actually imported to Canary Islands. So there's also a vulnerability. And also energy, right? Providing all the energy for these kind of temporary tourists who are sometimes in the island, sometimes not. And then we try to come up with these, to address these challenges, looking at all of the different kinds of hazards and interactions between hazards that take place. So we're moving away from assessing, a study where we say, what is the, for example, the flood risk in region X, and how can we solve that? To saying, what's the challenge, what are the sectors involved, and how can we come to solutions that address all of those different hazards? So I think at heart, that's what we're trying to do within MYRIAD. A little bit about how we set up the project, and I don't want to go into this in a lot of detail, but we started off the project in the first 9 months. So we just finished this with what we call the diagnosis. So we were really looking into the current literature and talking to people who've been working in this field about current definitions on multi-risk, current policies, current documents, current studies, current methods, current tools that already exist. And we use that to build a framework to actually help stakeholders then to actually assess and manage risk. And the idea is that this framework is iteratively tested and updated within those pilots, those case studies throughout the project. So that's why the cases are really in the middle. They're at the heart of our project. And they are fed by some more, let's say, content scientific driven work packages. One of them looking at trying to actually quantify these dynamic feedbacks or changes between different risk drivers, hazard, exposure, vulnerability. One of them is looking at multi-risk scenarios in the future, and also trying to develop a software which we can use to very quickly and easily make realistic combinations of different kinds of hazard events, risk events. And then this work package 6, risk-informed decision-making, which is also bringing in social science methods about how can we better interact with stakeholders to actually come up with these pathways. And then, of course, we also have communication, outreach, etc. What we think is really important within MYRIAD is that we really, because we're actually trying to develop these concrete pathways, that we really have to work very closely between science and practice. So we have identified 4 different stakeholder groups within the project. So in those pilots, we have the pilot core user group. That's 3 or 5 organizations per case study who are very closely working with us, testing our methods, testing our tools, giving us constant feedback in the project. Then within each pilot, we have a more loose pilot stakeholder group who we inform, but not necessarily having the time to commit so much to the project. Outside the pilots, we also have potential users who may be interested in using the tools which we develop, and then wider stakeholders who may be not so interested directly in using our tools, but just getting an overview and update of the conceptual thinking around the project. And actually, we found it quite useful to make this distinction between these different stakeholder groups, because it allows us to have a very different explicit level of interaction with these different kinds of stakeholders. So we're not asking too much or reaching out to stakeholders who only want to be involved in a less or more way. So who's in the consortium? Well, it's a consortium of 19 institutions, research institutes, universities, small companies, etc. But what we've tried to do is for each of the sectors that we're looking at, the economic sectors, we've actually brought on a representative from practice. So, for example, we have Aon representing the finance sector. We have TNO who are representing the energy sector. We have Wetlands International there to represent the ecosystem sector, and several others of these kinds of organizations. So they really tie us in to the realities of the sectors in which they work. So that's a little bit about the project setup, etc. But yeah, we're a year in, so it's time that we present some of our first results from the project, and that's what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes or so. I won't go into any detail, but just to give a potted overview of some of the work we've been doing and what we plan to do in the coming months and years. So we started off with work package 1, which is this diagnosis. So really looking at the current literature, past literature, engaging with stakeholders through workshops, focus groups, interviews, etc. And many of you have been involved in these various sessions as well. So here's a wonderful team who did that work or led that work, mainly our colleagues from the British Geological Survey with input from across the entire consortium. They did a tremendous work, and just recently we launched our first 3 deliverables from the project. One of those, which I think could be of interest for this group, is a handbook of multi-hazard, multi-risk definitions and concepts. So we're actually talking about, well, what it says, those definitions, existing methods, existing tools that one may want to look at or think about when carrying out such an assessment. We also have a report on existing policies, policy-making process and governance for multi-risk management. And I was hoping to be able to show you our multi-risk wiki, but we hope that this will actually be launched next week. So quite exciting. It's ready to launch, but we're just finalizing user agreements, privacy agreements, and those sort of things. But what is it? Basically, it will be like a Wikipedia kind of page where anybody can contribute knowledge related to multi-risk assessment and management. So I'm just spin through this one. Here's a sneak preview of what it looks like. You enter the disaster risk gateway, that's the name of the wiki, and you have some options, right? So you can look at definitions, you can look at information about multi-hazard risk assessment, multi-hazard risk management. And then if you click through, for example, the multi-hazard risk assessment, there's actually, you will find that there's an expose of different tools, different platforms, different methods, different projects that have been looking at these in the past. And the idea is that, well, we brought together an initial overview from our diagnosis phase, but actually this is supposed to be a community effort, right? So we want the scientific and practitioners community to contribute to this. It's like a real wiki, right? So people can contribute and build this knowledge base as we go forward in the future. So also an invitation to you when this is launched. If people are interested in contributing, there will be that option to do that. So coming soon, keep your eyes and ears peeled. Maybe from the literature review, I think a few of the interesting findings I can go through. And I listed 6 here. It's a bit of a boring slide with all the text, but I'll just talk you through some of these main findings. So found out that terminology and definitions matter. Or maybe they don't. So what I mean by that is we found that a lot of publications tend to define words afresh. So we find many documents talking about the same thing, but each time reinventing the definitions, using different phrases, which makes it quite difficult for scientists and practitioners to really understand each other. And that's why in this wiki, we try to bring together an overview of terms, not prescribing which terms one should use, because different people, different communities have different terms, but at least to try and get an understanding of how terms are used differently in different communities. We also found that adding the multi as a prefix to every term associated with disaster risk management can be quite confusing. For example, we've been publications talking about multi-hazard, multi-risk, multi-vulnerability, multi-exposure, multi-management, and so forth. But you find that when you start discussing with practitioners and policymakers, it actually adds more confusion than it solves. And so perhaps part of the paradigm shift we're looking for is simply just to view risk, vulnerability, exposure, risk reduction, etc., through this multiple lens, rather than having to reinvent lots of terminology to add this multiple layer on top of it. We found that we analyzed a little bit the scope and scale of some of the existing approaches, and found that there's a lot of examples of hazard and risk assessment in literature. Well, a growing amount, and that's great. But we found not so much about multi-risk management within the literature. So that's something to be noted was important going forward. And also, whilst there's some studies looking at the past, using historic conditions, we see very few forward-looking multi-hazard, multi-risk studies. We found that I think we know it, but we confirmed that the current multi-risk governance or risk governance field is rather siloed, right? So there's little interaction between different kinds of governance actors, and that can be a hindrance to really managing risk. We found also that a lot of the user perspectives are not very well captured and or shared in the literature. So a lot of projects work together with stakeholders and practice, but really this co-production process and the outputs are not so well documented, and that links to the other one. That also means that a lot of the good practices which are out there are not well documented, or maybe they are, but only in grey literature, which is rather inaccessible to the wider community. So that's some of the outputs of work package 1. We moved forward now into our second work package. So we brought together all of that thinking from the diagnosis. We had a very nice workshop back in April or May, I believe it was, in Austria, where we used that to develop a first version of our multi-risk framework. And I don't want to walk you through the framework, but basically this is a set of steps that a user practitioner could think of to go through when designing one of these forward-looking pathways. And this will change. That's the idea, right? So the idea is in our upcoming workshops with our pilots, we present this, we talk about it, and then the idea is we try and implement it and get iteratively 3 or 4 times throughout the project, update this framework as well. Just to touch on some of the work that Marleen de Ruiter and others have been doing on dynamic vulnerability. So Marleen published a very nice paper earlier this year in iScience, talking about the 3 different types of dynamics of vulnerability. So she saw in literature basically that you can have changes in vulnerability, for example, during very long-lasting disasters, long-lasting wars, for example, long-lasting droughts, really can have these long-term impacts on vulnerability. Changes due to compounding disasters and more shocks, right? So individual events which can actually lead to changes in vulnerability. And thirdly, these prior risk reduction efforts that can also change vulnerability. So like I talked about before, if you have the houses raised on stilts, it makes you more vulnerable, for example, to earthquakes. And in the paper, they come up with 3 methods that could be useful to try to get a better understanding of this dynamic vulnerability. So some more qualitative methods, like using narratives to get a better understanding of underlying processes. The use of agent-based models and system dynamics models to look at these real feedbacks within these systems. And also for exploring the future, the use of both scenario-based approaches, but also storylines, storytelling approaches. In work package 5, one thing I want to mention is a very exciting piece of work that one of our PhD students, Judith Klaassen, is working on. And she's trying to develop a historical single hazard event data. Well, no, actually, she's trying to use historic single hazard event data sets to develop a multi-hazard event data set of the past. So she's identified for 10 different hazards the start and end date of different hazards, a spatial footprint for each hazard, and a measure of their intensity. And then basically what she's trying to do now is look at overlaps in those hazards in time and in space to actually put together a database of past multi-hazard events. And that's in a nutshell what's been shown here on the bottom. Finally, this is quite a complicated figure, so I'm just going to show the main outline. Is some work is being carried out by Julius Schullenberger and colleagues, also doing this PhD in this project, to develop these multi-risk DRR, disaster risk reduction pathway approaches. So these are these kind of adaptive pathways that some of you may know about, and they've been developed and used quite a lot in the climate community. Basically, what they say is that if you want to adapt for some given peril, for example, you want to reduce flood hazard for housing in a particular region, then you have different options that you can take at different periods in time, right? So this would be for one hazard and one sector. You could kind of just do nothing for a while with the current management you have in place, but at some point in time, you may need to adapt, right? Because the climate changes or there's higher risk for some other reason. And then you may have two different options. For example, you may want to raise dikes or build new dikes. That would be the orange line. Or you could think about setting aside these floodplains and not building them, right? This is the yellow line. If you follow the yellow line, it means that in the future, if climate change becomes worse, you still have the option to move to dikes, for example. Right? So that's the idea of these pathways approaches. So far, they're really used in a single hazard, single sector setting. And what Julius is working on is to develop a methodology to really move this into the multi-hazard and multi-sector setting. So we get some quite complicated figures on the right. I don't want to go through the details of those, but what you actually see is that when you start looking at different hazards, you see that you also might get new adaptation pathways because you're looking through the lens of different policy and decision-making avenues. You also see, though, that it gets very complicated as because the red lines giving feedbacks between sectors, between different hazards, between different measures, and so forth. So the challenge going forward for Julius and the project is how we can really get a grip on this and make it something which is very easy to understand and tangible for our decision makers. So that brings me to the end of the content, just to say that MYRIAD-EU is all about collaboration. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're not trying to develop new single hazard scenarios. There's a lot of great work done by many people, including many of you doing that. What we're trying to do is see how can we use that kind of information and knowledge to better improve multi-hazard, multi-risk management. So we're really open to collaborations. And if you want to stay informed on a project, we have a website, MYRIAD-project.eu, and also quite an active Twitter account you can follow at MYRIAD_EU. So I close off there with this final slide with some information about the project. And thanks for listening, and I'll be happy to take questions and have a discussion.